So Jesus said, you said it, buddy. And Jesus said unto him, thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. Well, that did it for him. Eh? You know, it's interesting how many people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Isn't that ridiculous? They've never read any of the Gospels to say that makes such an absurd statement. That's what he claimed to be. That's the reason they crucified him. Then the high priest rent his clothes, which is against the law, by the way, saying, he hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? And they answered and said, he is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him in the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? Now Peter's outside, without the palace, and a damsel came to him, saying, thou also wast with Jesus of Galilee. And he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him, and said unto him that were there, this fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, surely thou art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. They could tell a Galilean accent. They spotted him. And he began to curse and swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. And he was reminded that's exactly what Jesus had prophesied earlier. Remember the word of Jesus which said unto him, before the cock crow thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. Can you imagine? Peter, bold Peter, aggressive Peter, denying our Lord. And that's going to get dealt with later by the Sea of Galilee. There's some lessons from Peter we don't want to pass without mentioning. The danger of self-confidence. He should have been praying, not sleeping, to avoid all of this. The consequences of prayerlessness. Could he not watch with 1 hour? The perils of companionship with the wicked. He shouldn't have even been there to get in these kinds of encounters. And of course, the influence of the fear of man. He didn't have the guts to stand up and say, yes, I'm with him. Proverbs 20, the fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. How tragic that we got some lessons there from Peter. Let's move on. Jesus' death was no accident. His words at the Last Supper make no sense at all if Jesus was not the master of his own death. Indeed he was. He maintained sovereign, premeditated, precise mastery, not just of the Lord's Supper, but also even in the garden and following. A God who is in control when the foundations of his own earthly existence are crumbling is a God who can be trusted to sustain us when it appears that our life is tumbling in. Lots of lessons here. Let's keep moving. Let's pick it up in John's narrative. After he did his upper room discourse, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out forth with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden into which he entered, and his disciples, and Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oftentimes resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh hither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, knowing all things that they should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, whom seek ye? They answered, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with him. And as soon as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. And he asked them again, whom seek ye? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I've told you that I am he. If there ye seek me, let these go their way. Notice who's in charge. Notice who's calling the shots. He's giving the orders. Jesus is. That the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, of them which thou gavest me, have I lost none. That's exciting. Remember that. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. His servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus said unto Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band of the captain officers took Jesus, bound him, and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, and the ones the Jews honored. Caiaphas, the Roman appointee, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. A very famous prophecy that was far more true than Caiaphas had any idea. Annas, of course, he was deposed by Pilate's predecessor, but he's still very influential. He's the vice president of the Sanhedrin, and he's patriarch of the family that held the office of high priest as late as AD 62, including 5 sons and a son-in-law. He had a large family. But anyway, we'll go on. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest. We suspect it was John, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. And then went out that other disciple which is known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door, Peter, art thou not one of this man's disciples? He says, I am not. And the servant's officer stood there. This again, this is a recounting of Peter's denials. They made a fire of coals. It was cold. They warmed themselves. Peter stood with them and warmed themselves. And the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples of his doctrine. And Jesus answered and said, I spoke openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. And in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. When he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. If well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. And he said, Art thou not one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter denied again, and immediately, of course, the cock crew. Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, for it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall. See, that's Gentile ground, that's Roman ground, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. This is really fascinating. It's such a farce. They have false witnesses that they've mustered here. They're violating all the laws in their book, and yet they don't dare cross the threshold for fear they would mar their eligibility to observe Passover. The quorum was 23. A majority of 2 is required. So it could be as few as 13 that caused this whole mess from a legal point of view. Now, Caiaphas was the Roman appointee. He's appointed each year, and that's in contrast to the law of God, in which the high priest was to serve until death. And many Jews resented the Roman intrusions. They still looked to Annas, not Caiaphas, as the real high priest. That's why you got both of them in the act here. Both of them will eventually stand before Christ in judgment. That's going to be an interesting scene. But his real name was Joseph, and he had a reputation for intrigue, bribery, and love of money, and what have you. There are 6 trials involved. We obviously won't detail them all, but they are in the scripture. There are 3 Jewish trials between Annas, then through Caiaphas, then formally before the Sanhedrin, that are recorded in John and Matthew, respectively. Then they don't have the authority for capital punishment. I'll explain that in a minute. So that leads to 3 Roman trials before Pilate, until Pilate discovers he can pawn it off maybe on a Galilean, Herod. That doesn't work. It comes back to Pilate, and Pilate has to deal with it. So we've got 6 trials. Now, what's interesting about this, self-incrimination was prohibited by law. Yeah, that's the way they indicted him. Virtually all aspects of all 6 trials that Jesus endured were illegally administered. The religious trial was over. The next step was the criminal trial before the civil authorities. Only they could execute him for death by a method that had been invented a century earlier and prophesied 7 centuries earlier. Very strange, very interesting. The binding of a prisoner before he was condemned was unlawful unless resistance was offered or expected. And of course, Jesus offered none. It was illegal for judges to participate in the arrest of the accused. They arranged it. There were no legal transactions, including a trial, could be conducted at night. That's Jewish law. The arrest was effected through the agency of an informant and traitor. That was illegal. While an acquittal could be pronounced the same day, any other verdict required a majority of 2 and had to come on a subsequent day. That was their law. That was all obviously ignored. No prisoner could be convicted on his own evidence against the law. It was the duty of the judge to see that the interest of the accused was fully protected. No, it was what we would call a kangaroo court from day one. Preliminary hearings before a magistrate were completely foreign to the Jewish legal systems. They didn't have preliminary hearing. The judges sought false witness against Jesus. That was against the law. In a Jewish court, the accused was to be assumed innocent until proved guilty by 2 or more witnesses. That obviously was not operative here. The Jews failed to find 2 witnesses agreeing. They even then couldn't agree. They had to get him on his own testimony. When the witnesses first disagreed, the prisoner should have been released. That was the procedure. The trial under Caiaphas took place in his home rather than the council chamber where it should have been held. The council lacked civil authority to condemn a man to death. That was a Roman prerogative, and that's what they're going to try to invoke here. It was illegal to conduct the session of the court on a feast day. It just adds up on and on. There are books written on this. I've just given you the highlights. A guilty verdict was rendered without evidence. The balloting was illegal. It should have been done by roll, with the youngest voting first. Typical wardroom procedure in the Navy, let alone in the... Anyway, the sentence was finally passed in the palace of the high priest, but the law demanded it be pronounced in the temple in the hall of hewn stone. There were all these procedures that were ignored. This was a railroad job, obviously. The high priest rends his garment. That's expressly prohibited in Leviticus 21:10. And if he did not have his priestly robe on, he couldn't have put Christ under oath. So we know he had his priestly robe, but it was the priestly robe that he tore. That's against the law too. So it compounds. 6 trials. Annas, Caiaphas, and Sanhedrin, then the Roman trials. Before Pilate, before Herod, and then again before Pilate. So we'll take a look at the Roman trials. Picking up in Matthew 27, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away to deliver him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now, why is all that going on? Because the scepter had departed from Judah. Archelaus was the second son of Herod the Great. And I won't get into all this. His older son was murdered by Herod the Great, along with other family members. That's the whole thing in Josephus. And his mother was never accepted. A lot of issues. But after the death of Herod, Archelaus had been placed over Judea as ethnarch by Caesar Augustus. He was broadly rejected. He was dethroned and banished in 6 to 7 A.D. Get the dates here. It's very interesting. He was replaced by a Roman procurator called Coponius. And the legal power of the Sanhedrin was immediately restricted, and the adjudication of capital cases was lost. That was standard Roman policy that Coponius instituted. And this is all in Josephus' War of the Jews. And it's also recorded in the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, when members of the Sanhedrin found themselves deprived of their right over life and death, this is now 6 or 7 AD, this is a couple of decades earlier, they covered their heads with ashes and their bodies with sackcloth, and they bemoaned the following: Woe unto us, for the scepter has departed from Judah, and the Messiah has not come. This is recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. They actually thought the word of God was broken, because Genesis 49:10 said the scepter shall not depart from Judah until the Messiah comes. And they saw the scepter departing, which is indicative of having lost the capital punishment. What they didn't realize is that while they were parading themselves around town in sackcloth, bemoaning their belief that the word of God had been broken, there was a young man growing up in Nazareth in a carpenter shop. Pontius Pilate served as 6th Roman procurator from AD 26 to AD 36. After which he was recalled to Rome, by the way, and passed out of official history. He was hated by Orthodox Jews and never really understood them. And a plaque bearing his name was found in Caesarea that you can visit when you visit Israel. You'll see it. And but he ruled Judea with a reckless and arbitrary fashion. He displeased the Romans too, by the way. And he was deposed by Vitellius, sent to Rome, tried under Caligula. There is a tradition that he killed himself, but the Coptic Jews have a different orientation. They believe he actually became a Christian. So what's that based on? Scholars argue about it. We won't take the time. I think it's kind of interesting. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he was Christian, as we'll see hints of that brewing in the things that confronted him. Getting back to Matthew, then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood. Blood is always associated with silver in the scripture. They said, what is that to us? See it out of that. See thou to that. And he cast down the piece of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. And the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, it's not lawful to put them into the treasury because it is the price of blood. But they had good CPAs on staff. They took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. See, they couldn't put it in the treasury, but they could prepay anticipated expenses with it. And the temple was responsible for strangers that died in the precincts, so they had every year some of those to pay for. There was a bargain piece of ground they could buy for a potter's field. It was a potter's field, so they took the money to buy that as their way of getting around the prohibition of putting it in the treasury. Wherefore that field is called the field of blood unto this day. Now what's fascinating about this is back there in Zechariah, we read this interesting prophecy in chapter 11. He said, son of man, you think good, give me my price, if not forbear. And they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, cast it into the potter, a goodly price that I was prized out of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. And I think this is rather interesting. We got the price, 30 pieces of silver. We got the location of the transaction in the temple, in the house of the Lord. Who ends up with the money? The guy that owned the field, the potter. All that's prophesied 5 centuries before the fact. The precision is astonishing. But we'll move on. See, this is even alluded to. This is confirmed in Matthew. This was fulfilled by that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value, and gave them to the potter's field as the Lord had appointed me. And Jeremy the prophet was a collection of scrolls that included Zechariah, which is, a lot of people stumble on that detail, but let's move on. Now this man purchased a field with the reward of iniquity. This is the book of Acts summarizing this. And falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst, and all his bowels gushed out. And it was known unto all the dwellers in Jerusalem, insomuch that field is called in the proper tongue Aceldama, which is to say the field of blood. So that's well documented. Pilate has a number of interviews with Christ, 4 on the inside and 3 on the outside, 7 encounters that are summarized primarily in the Gospel of John. Pilate tries again every artifact known to a bureaucrat to try to get out from under this situation that he's been maneuvered into. Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered up to thee. Kind of impudent response. And then said Pilate unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said to him, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. See, that's the real issue. Now he tries to get out from under this a number of times. He says, you judge him. And then he announces him innocent. Pilate announces him innocent. The personal representative of the ruler of the world pronounces him innocent. The Jews, though, talk him into substituting Barabbas for the one to get out from under it, he's going to offer as a holiday celebration someone set free. They insist they pick this other guy rather than Jesus. Then he tries to abuse him enough so he'd win the sympathy of the crowd, and that doesn't work. Play on their pity. And then he said, behold your king. And it doesn't work, obviously. But anyway, continuing here, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. And Pilate said unto him, hearest thou how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. He didn't defend himself. Didn't even try. That was also prophesied, as we'll see in Isaiah 53. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, art thou the king of the Jews? That caught his ear, huh? He answered him, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it of thee? Pilate said, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered unto the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said to him, art thou a king then? Jesus answered, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Then Pilate's famous, rhetorical, cynical question, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said to them, I find in him no fault at all. See, Pilate recognizes that this guy's been delivered up for envy. But the crowds out there, bribed of course, and they were the more fierce, saying, he stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now when Pilate heard Galilee, he asked whether or not this is a Galilean. See, he's got a bureaucratic exit here, maybe because Herod's in charge of Galilee. Let's give him the problem. As soon as he knew that he belonged under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. How convenient. Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, and Malchus a Samaritan woman, so he's never really accepted by the Jews for lots of different reasons. Half Edomian, half Samaritan. The Edomites were the enemies of Israel, you understand. Without a drop of Jewish blood in his veins. So Galilee of the Gentiles seemed to fit dominion for that kind of a prince. He ruled as Tetrarch of Galilee from 4 BC to about 39 AD. When Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of long season, because he had heard of the many things of him. He hoped to have seen some miracles done by him. He's looking for entertainment here, huh? Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. The chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught, mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. The same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. So there's all kinds of speculation about that. See, Pilate was using a bureaucratic artifact here. It didn't work. But it did bridge the chasm between them. Both of them would be shortly stripped of all their power, and they both would die, apparently, in shameful exile. But we'll move on. Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, said to them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. See, for of necessity, he must release one unto them at the feast. That was a tradition that he was following, hoping this would work. Now at that feast, the governor was wont to release to the people a prisoner whom they would, but they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. It's interesting that Pilate would use the term Messiah. Christ is a title. Jesus, who is called Christ or called the Messiah. That's an interesting phrase for Pilate to use. And he realized that he was deliberately maneuvered in the spot because of envy. When he was set down at the judgment seat, his wife sent to him and said, Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Can you imagine? Pilate's got a spot. He's got a jurisdictional problem he's got to deal with somehow. He wants to wash his hands of this whole thing, which he does literally shortly. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitude, bribes are passed obviously, that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And the governor answered and said to them, Whither of the twain will ye that I release unto you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, What shall I do then with Jesus who is called Christ? They all said unto him, Let him be crucified. So you got a mob rule situation. The governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, and that was the fear of the Roman administrator. He just wanted his report card back in Rome will be, can he keep the thing under control? He saw a tumult was made. He took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. And then released he Barabbas unto them, and then he scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. You know, it's really tragic how the early church attempted to pin the entire rose on the Jews. John, in his gospel, when he speaks of the Jews, he's alluding to the leadership of the Jews. And it's tragic that this anti-Semitism in the early church had its roots in this idea of trying to blame this whole thing on the Jews. He was murdered by Gentiles under Gentile authority. So if you want to blame someone for the death of Christ, blame me. It was my fault. My sins put him on that cross. Let's take a look at Barabbas briefly. Let's not pass on this one. He stood under the righteous condemnation of the law. He was guilty and he knew he was. Everybody knew he was. He knew the one who was to take his cross and take his place was innocent. He knew that. Everybody did. He knew that Jesus Christ was for him a true substitute. They're going to switch places, in effect. He knew that he had done nothing to merit going free while another took his place. Get the picture of Barabbas, the predicament he's in. They're changing places. The murderer's bonds, curse, disgrace, and mortal agony were transferred to the righteous Jesus. While the liberty, innocence, safety, and well-being of the Nazarene became the lot of the murderer. Do you see the switch? Do you see the contrast? A mutual exchange of position. Barabbas is installed with all the rights and privileges of Jesus Christ, while the latter enters upon all the infamy and horror of the rebel's position. The delinquent's guilt and cross become the lot of the just one, and the civil rights and immunities of the latter are now the property of the delinquent. See the reversal. Where are you and I in this picture? We're in Barabbas' shoes. He took our place. He took our place. as you watch this drama, recognize where you're at and where he's at. He is in our place. That is Jesus. Then Pilate took therefore Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers platted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him with their hands. This is the John recording. And then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus to the common hall, gathered unto him a whole band of soldiers. They stripped him, put on him a scarlet robe. When they platted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. They bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Let's pick up the thread with John. Pilate therefore went forth again and said unto them, "Behold, I bring him forth unto you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him." This is a repeat. We're just going to recount the ground here a little bit. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns, the purple robe, and Pilate said unto him, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests therefore and the officers saw him and cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him," Pilate said unto them, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." And we have this famous painting by Antonio Ciceri called Ecce Homo that captures the flavor of the moment, indeed, as Pilate tries to maneuver a way out of this predicament. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he became more afraid. I can imagine. What if he's right? He went again to the judgment hall and said unto Jesus, "Whence art thou?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said unto him, "Speakest not unto me? Knowest not that I have the power to crucify thee and have the power to release thee?" And Jesus said, "Thou couldst have no power at all against thee, except to be given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend." Unusual argument for a Jew to give to a Roman. "Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar." That's the kind of accusation Pilate could not afford to ignore. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in the place called in the pavement, but in Hebrew, the Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief answered, said, "We have no king but Caesar." That's a remarkable remark for the chief priests. I'll bet you that's the only time they've ever acknowledged that, before or later. Hosea has an interesting prophecy in chapter 3. "For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice." What is this talking about? After 70 AD, isn't it? "And without an image, and without an ephod, and without a teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return, and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days." Interesting prophecy in Hosea. Hosea is full of some real insights. Getting back to John, they delivered him therefore to be crucified. They took Jesus, led him away, and bearing his cross went forth into a place called in the place of the skull, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Golgotha. And so we go from the Last Supper in Gethsemane to the crucifixion scene. And if you go to Israel, this is the way it looks today. There is an area that looks like a skull. That's not the reason we believe this is Golgotha. Many people misunderstand. There's other reasons for this. If you take a topological map of Mount Moriah, which is a ridge system up between two other mountains, Mount of Olives on the east and Mount Zion on the west. You have Mount Zion and the Tyropian Valley originally, Mount of Olives and the Kedron Valley, and the valley, Hinnom Valley at the south. That's the rough topology. But if you follow that ridge system up, it starts about 600 meters above sea level at Ophel to the thrashing floor of Aruna where the temple is, but that's not the peak. That's about 742 meters. You get up to the peak, which is a place called Golgotha. That's where the Akedah took place, where Abram offered Isaac, despite some traditions to the contrary. And we have the peak there. That's where Abram offered Isaac, we believe, and this is also where the crucifixion took place. Now, there are people that have other theories, but it's interesting that Leviticus 1 and Leviticus 6 indicates that all burnt offerings and sin offerings are to be on the north side of the camp. Some people try to believe it was on the Mount of Olives. We don't hold that view for a number of reasons. This is one of them. And because it should be on all burnt offerings and sin offerings on the north side, outside the camp, without the gate, and it meets all those conditions. When they crucified him with two others, one on either side and Jesus in the midst, the American Medical Association had an extensive description of the death, published in 1986. which is an excerpt from that report, due the pain endured by the weight of the body hanging from the nails, which damage the medial nerves and tear at the tarsals, the respiratory torture, the cramping, the pleural effusions, concluded that death by crucifixion was in every sense of the word excruciating, literally out of the cross. The word excruciating comes from this manner of death, incidentally. And we could talk more about that, but let's move on. This interesting thing, Pilate wrote a titlan. It's a label on the